In the final years of the 19th century, when westward expansion was redefining borders and migratory flows, itinerant photographers captured scenes of bohemian life in brothels. By posing in ornate rooms, sex workers revealed routines, consumption, and internal hierarchies, preserving traces of local gender and economics. An image dated 1900 shows a young Native American mother rocking her son. The setting reveals the final years of the conquest of the West, when many nations were adjusting to new boundaries. Her clothing, adorned with beads and fringe, highlights artisanal skill inherited through generations. The tender gaze confirms the persistence of family bonds and rituals, even under external pressures. In 1887, in what was then the Montana Territory, Mary Stuart was photographed at Fort McGinnis, a military post erected 7 years earlier to safeguard settlers and stagecoach routes. At the time, she was engaged in a secret betrothal to Teddy Blue, a matter she confided in letters in which she praised her father, Granville, for his generosity and attentiveness in dressing his children in top-quality clothing. 1870s, Death Valley, California. With the boom in borax used in soaps and glass, 20 mule teams emerged to cover 260 kilometers to the nearest railroad. In the arid Great Basin setting, each trip carried 36 tons of the mineral, connecting isolated mines to the industrial centers of the Pacific. In 1875, William Henry Jackson photographed 4 brothers of the Kilcohawk Band, Pawnee, during a joint expedition surveying the American West's railroads. The image underscores kinship, social standing, and ceremonial attire, at a time when the Pawnee served as guides for the U.S. Army and were re-evaluating alliances after conflicts on the Great Plains. In 1901, in the American interior marked by border conflicts, an anonymous young woman wields a half-stock rifle, a weapon known for its agile handling and more accurate shot. The object symbolizes women's participation in domestic defense during a period when daily security depended on the family's readiness against threats from raiders and land disputes. Black Elk on the left portrays himself as a young warrior and future spiritual leader of the Oglala Lakota, participant in the indigenous victory at Little Bighorn in 1876. Decades later, he would witness the Wounded Knee Massacre, a tragic milestone marking the end of the Indian Wars on the Great Plains. In 1882, at the height of the Great Plains transformation by railroad expansion and buffalo hunting, William Alma's camera captured an Arapaho mother and her son. Their traditional clothing reflects an economy based on hide and trade with settlers, while in the background one glimpses the expanse of prairie that, a few years later, would be designated as reservations. In 1878, Texas Ranger James B. Gillette appears mounted on the horse duty, at a time when the Texas frontier was the scene of conflicts among settlers, cattle rustlers, and indigenous nations. Established in 1823 and formalized after the war with Mexico, the Rangers covered vast distances to maintain order. Gillette distinguished himself by capturing armed gangs, an action that reinforced the Corps' reputation in the Old West. Quanah Parker, Comanche chief born c. 1845, led his people in the Plains Wars. Son of Cynthia Ann Parker and warrior Peta Nocona, he became a central voice against buffalo hunters who weakened his culture. After surrendering in 1875 at Fort Sill, he guided the transition to reservations and advocated for tribal rights. The image, dated around 1900 in the then province of Alberta, documents a moment of cultural contact in Western Canada. It depicts 2 members of the Blackfoot, a Great Plains people whose buffalo hunting routes traversed what is now Canada and the United States. At the beginning of the 20th century, railroad expansion and encroaching settlers were altering their territories and way of life. In the 1870s in Lee County, a region marked by the turbulence of the post-Civil War era, James S. Scarborough rose to prominence as sheriff. Armed with his 6-shot revolver, he patrolled dusty roads to protect farms and stagecoach lines against gangs that looted local businesses. The effectiveness of these patrols earned him the electorate's trust for 2 successive terms. In the late 19th century, at the height of the Northern Pacific's railroad expansion, 2 courtesans posed elegantly in a luxurious salon of a brothel in Miles City, Montana. The town, then home to 1,000 residents, was considered by a judge to be a den of vice and violence, a reflection of the frontier's sudden boom. Kamehuevi children, born at the turn of the 20th century, appear in the arid landscape that shaped their daily life. They belong to the southern branch of the Paiute, who traveled the Mojave Desert and the banks of the Colorado River in areas that are now Arizona and California, gathering seeds, hunting small game, and passing on knowledge about scarce water and seasonal roots, the basis of collective survival. In 1878, photographer M.C. Ragsdale captured 2 moments on wet collodion plates of the Texas Rangers Company, commanded by Captain Dan Roberts, camped beside the isolated Fort McCavitt in Menard County. These images show the routine of the patrolmen who, after the Civil War, protected settlers' routes against attacks on the western frontier. The second scene appears later in the video. In the 1880s in Caldwell, Kansas, a vital point on the Chisholm Trail, a cowboy posed with chaps that protected his legs from the elements and thorny vegetation during long drives leading herds to the trains supplying eastern markets. In 1891, at the end of the 19th century, the Pine Ridge Reservation in the Great Plains of South Dakota was still feeling the impact of Wounded Knee, 1890, and the Dawes Act. In this context, the Sioux chiefs Two Strike, Crow Dog, and High Hawk led the Oglala in organizing camps, distributing federal rations, and holding councils that determined hunts, alliances, and appeals to courts in Washington. In the photographs taken by M.C. Ragsdale in 1878, when the Texas Rangers patrolled the newly pacified borders after Reconstruction, the posture of one guard draws attention. He places his knife in front of the holster, a method that shortened the movement between hand and blade during sudden confrontations on the vast prairies of the American Southwest. Last known image of George Armstrong Custer, nicknamed Boy General, famed Union cavalry officer in the Civil War, and later commander of the 7th Regiment in the conquest of the Great Plains. The photograph, from April 1876, when he was 36 years old, was taken 2 months before his death at the Battle of Little Bighorn against Lakota and Cheyenne forces. In the 1916 image from the Rosebud Reservation, South Dakota, Chief Black Bull emerges as a crucial leader of the Sikangu Lakota. Amid the pressures of the early 20th century, he convened councils, preserved rituals such as the Sun Dance, and mediated internal disputes. His influence extended beyond Rosebud, strengthening networks among Sioux communities along the Upper Missouri. In the 1870s, Texas experienced post-Civil War consolidation and the expansion of railroads. Ranger Gus Gildea appears dressed for frontier duty, a wide-brimmed hat against the sun, a wool coat for cold crossings, and V-top boots, practical for riding. At his waist stands the Bowie knife, feared in skirmishes with outlaws and territorial disputes. At the turn of the 1850s, after Frederick S. Archer's invention of the wet collodion process, 1851, the ambrotype spread across the United States, requiring less exposure time and costing less than the daguerreotype. Itinerant photographers set up tents along stagecoach routes, charcoal camps, and mining fields. The subject's identity is unknown. The image reflects a frontier society in flux. On the Little Bone Reserve near Grenfell, Saskatchewan, Chief Cree Pipichas had led the Saquime since 1884, the decade following Treaty 4 of 1874, when the Crown sought to regulate prairie settlement. Between visits from federal agents and the arrival of railway tracks, he negotiated supplies, defended lands, and upheld rituals that sustained his people's identity. An 1887 image shows Texas Ranger Ira Otten, famous for his decisive actions in armed combats in the American Southwest. He appears wearing a wide-brimmed hat, a revolver holster at his waist, and a knife positioned in front, a common practice among patrolmen after the Civil War, when border surveillance against cattle thieves demanded immediate reaction. Greenwood County, Kansas, late 19th century. Pioneers paused their march across the Great Plains and, in the shade of a Conestoga wagon, shared simple meals. Since the Homestead Act of 1862, trails such as the Santa Fe and the rail network had attracted families seeking free plots, turning prairies into agricultural communities. In 1903, now elderly and celebrated by the U.S. press, Nez Perce leader Joseph posed in front of the camera in a Seattle studio. The image encapsulates decades of resistance. Since 1877, he had led long marches to evade the army, lobbied in Washington for a return to the Wallowa Valley, and denounced colonial encroachment on indigenous lands. His steadfast gaze evokes hope for future generations. Andrew Jackson Sowell, a veteran of the Texas Rangers from 1870 to 1871, published in 1884 his memoirs of the period when the border was healing from the Civil War. Among the items described are V-top boots with stars and decorative stitching, a common piece of attire for Southwest riders and the inspiration for the pair worn by Curly Bill Brocious in Tombstone, 1993, a symbol of the Old West. At the turn of the 20th century, when the rodeo was solidifying as a popular spectacle of the American West, Joella Irwin stood out by competing in roping and riding events alongside men. Her skill demonstrated that women could compete on equal footing, paving the way for future generations and changing the rural sports landscape. In 1905, at the Colville Indian Reservation in Washington State, a photographer documented a baby and a girl among pine trees on the banks of the Columbia. The scene reflects daily life after decades of forced relocations that culminated in 1872 with the creation of the reservation, where the Okanagan, Colville, and other peoples sought to preserve family bonds and knowledge in the face of American expansion. On February 16, 1887, in front of a grocery store in Cotulla, South Texas, 12 Texas Rangers line up. The scene falls in the years of law consolidation after the Civil War and the expansion of railroads, when the Corps fought smugglers and cattle thieves on the border. 4 of them display V-top boots, a popular Western fashion that distinguished the official uniform. Taken in 1884 on a cabinet card at the San Carlos Reservation, Arizona, the scene depicts Geronimo, the Apache leader whose campaigns against the U.S. Army defined the Apache Wars. 2 years before his surrender, the photo illustrates how mobile studios in the West documented native peoples for distant audiences. Around 1900, in the dry lands of northern Arizona, a Hopi mother and daughter maintained the ancestral routines inherited over centuries. In the pueblos, they planted blue corn, shaped pottery, celebrated dances in honor of the Katsanam, and followed the agricultural calendar that guided the community. Settlers' trails and the Santa Fe Railroad already cut through the desert, but the family preserved the traditional order. Around the end of the 19th century, in Rialtos, South Texas, men of Company D of the Texas Rangers pose in formation for the camera. The unit, celebrated for patrolling the border with Mexico and curbing cattle theft, displays martial discipline. In the front row, 2 Rangers place their knives in front of their holsters, a gesture that reinforces their reputation for readiness in border patrol. Jesse Woodson James emerged in Missouri devastated by the Civil War, fighting as a Confederate guerrilla before leading, with his brother Frank, the James Younger Gang. From 1866 to 1881, he robbed banks, trains, and stagecoaches, defying Pinkerton agents and symbolizing the chaos of Reconstruction. He was killed on April 3, 1882 by Robert Ford, a former associate. In 1911, when the Piegan were feeling the end of the buffalo herds and the imposition of borders by the U.S. and Canada, the Pledgers stood out. A link between generations, he led ceremonies, recounted Blackfoot hunts and alliances, safeguarding stories and values. His leadership emerged after treaties that restricted hunting and solidified the reservations, making his voice decisive in preserving the language and the Sundance. Myra Maybelle Bell Shirley Starr appears as a young woman in a rural post-Civil War Missouri setting. The daughter of prosperous farmers, she socialized with William Clark Quantrill and the James and Younger brothers, who turned to banditry after the conflict. On the unstable frontier, Bell learned to ride, handle weapons, and use her reputation to move among gangs, becoming a legend of the Old West. At the height of the United States westward march in the mid-19th century, Christopher Kit Carson distinguished himself as a trapper, explorer, and skilled mountain man. Between 1842 and 1844, he guided John C. Fremont's scientific expeditions, which mapped essential routes to the Pacific, cementing his notoriety in frontier history. In the 1920s, when railroads and rural expansion intensified contact between native peoples and settlers in the U.S. Northwest, Chief Joe Lamoose, nicknamed Flathead, stood out as a central voice for his nation. He took part in assemblies, mediated conflicts with authorities, and articulated demands for land and resources, ensuring internal cohesion in the face of social and economic change. In 1884, at the height of the traveling fairs that romanticized the Old West after the end of the American frontier, Annie Oakley joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Her precise aim and shooting exhibitions made her a main attraction, elevating her to an international symbol of female skill at the time, and helping spread the frontier myth around the world. A C-1880 photograph remains shrouded in mystery regarding the identities of those present. Studies suggest that the standing man is John Kinney, a notorious outlaw who, 5 years earlier, led a gang of raiders in southern New Mexico territory, a region marked by land disputes, conflict between ranchers, and unstable post-war order. Montana, 1920. Stumphorn, leader of the Northern Cheyenne, lifts the rifle captured on June 25, 1876, at the Battle of Little Bighorn, when Lakota and Cheyenne alliances defeated Colonel Custer's 7th Cavalry. 44 years later, the weapon remains testimony to indigenous resistance in the face of North American colonial expansion and reaffirms Stumphorn's prestige within the community. In Cripple Creek, Colorado, during the height of the gold rush, sex workers and dancers wore aprons over already short dresses to conceal their ankles, which were then considered provocative. The norm, imposed by Victorian customs at the end of the 19th century, aimed to avoid embarrassment in saloons and maintain an appearance of decency amid the mining frenzy. In 1899, when the American frontier was already closing and the stagecoach era was giving way to the train, Pearl Hart shocked Arizona by robbing a payroll coach near Globe. Arrested, she gained notoriety in a country fascinated by outlaws and, upon being featured in Cosmopolitan, became a late symbol of the Old West myth. Her daring also challenged the gender roles of the time. In 1885, in the White Mountain Range, the Apache scout Peneltish, called Zoc, guided troops and caravans through Arizona's canyons. He took part in the final campaigns of the Apache Wars, knowing ancestral hunting trails, hidden springs, and lookout points used by Cochise and Geronimo. His keen vision anticipated ambushes and kept generations of experience alive. The image depicts early 20th century California. After the Red Light Abatement Act of 1913 and Prohibition in 1920, attempts at moralization failed. Clandestine networks expanded, supplying brothels and illegal bars that became economic pillars of the urban underworld, sustaining corruption and violence in port cities amid the oil boom and the nascent film industry. In 1895, in the newly organized Oklahoma Territory, the clash between federal marshals and Bill Doolin's gang symbolized the twilight of the Old West. In that skirmish at Ingalls, the young Rose Dunn, then 15 years old, crossed the town square under heavy fire to bring ammunition and aid her outlaw boyfriend, an action that earned her the nickname Cimarron Rose. A young Chiricahua Apache wears ceremonial attire that echoes centuries of resistance in the American Southwest. Beads, shells, and geometric motifs mark migrations, alliances, and conflicts of the 19th century. Pendants symbolize kinship and spiritual guardianship, recalling the memory preserved after the 1886 surrender and the years at Fort Sill, where the community reorganized. In 1965, Raquel Welch began her career in cinema, emerging amid the cultural effervescence of the 1960s, marked by the expansion of female roles in Hollywood. In 1968, in The Western Bandolero, she broadened her artistic reach, reflecting the studio's effort to revitalize the genre and consolidating her place in the history of world entertainment. In 1885, Texas John Slaughter posed already celebrated for his patrols during the Civil War and for the success of the cattle drives crossing the Chisholm Trail. The lens captured him at the height of Texas's transition to Arizona territory, when he founded the San Bernardino Ranch, reflecting the cattle industry's expansion and the consolidation of the Southwest frontier in a setting of railroad growth and tensions with native peoples. A young Kiowa wears ceremonial attire that, since the 19th century, symbolizes the cultural resistance of the nation on the southern plains of the U.S. Embroidered geometric patterns denote lineage and hunting feats. Glass beads, brought by trade routes in the 1830s, reveal intertribal contacts and exchanges with settlers. Each piece sustains collective memory and ancestral knowledge. Between 1879 and 1883, stagecoaches that crossed the Russian River Valley, a vital route between Sonoma and Mendocino, endured successive attacks by Charles E. Bowles, Black Bart. Disguised, he would subdue drivers without firing a shot, collecting mail sacks and money. The robberies highlighted the weaknesses of overland transport at a time of rapid economic expansion in Northern California. In 1850s Arizona, Olive Oatman, a young pioneer headed for California, was captured during her family's migration. Traded to the Mojave by the Yavapai, she lived in the village on the banks of the Colorado River for nearly 4 years. The blue tattoo on her chin, made with cactus pigment, marked a form of protection for the passage to the spiritual world according to Mojave cosmology. At the end of the 19th century, an Apache warrior stands silently, wielding bow and arrow, instruments central to the lives of southwestern nations. These objects, forged for hunting and combat, express the bond between man, territory, and lineage, evoking struggles against invaders in present-day Arizona and New Mexico, and the ongoing defense of villages, rituals, and ancestral narratives. During the height of the California Gold Rush, 1848-1855, the influx was varied and intense. Among the newcomers were women of multiple backgrounds and professions who defied restrictive stereotypes. Singers, dancers, and actresses supplied makeshift stages in mining towns, offering entertainment to a predominantly male society and turning their talent into prosperity. Unofficially founded by Stephen F. Austin in 1823 and formalized in 1835, the Texas Rangers acted as a volunteer armed force, patrolling borders, capturing outlaws, and serving as scouts in the Mexican-American War, supporting the Texas Revolution and the subsequent Republic, and shaping state security. A photograph taken in Genoa, Nebraska, around the end of the 19th century, shows a Pawnee woman in a formal pose. Her beads and hairstyle evoke the ancient Pawnee presence on the banks of the Platte, where they hunted buffalo and celebrated the morning star. The scene connects the lands ceded in treaties of the 1870s to the cultural vitality maintained by the nation, now based in Oklahoma. At Vera McGinnis's debut at Madison Square Garden in 1924, the peak of urban rodeos that brought the Old West to big cities, the horsewoman broke new ground. She appeared riding a graceful black horse, her long skirt swirling down to her feet. The audience, accustomed to male stars, saw the advance of women in equestrian shows, reinforcing Western iconography in New York's popular culture. In an antique shop in Missouri, Mark Lee Gardner discovered a previously unknown photograph revealing an unusual scene of the American West. In it, a woman, possibly a rural landowner, stands before her home in the late 19th century, a time of agricultural expansion and the consolidation of frontiers. Around 1900 in Arizona Territory, two young Apache women apply themselves to the age-old art of basketry. Seated on the ground, they work yucca and willow fibers into complex geometric designs that, for centuries, have held food and clan memories. The firm weaving reflects wisdom passed down by elder women and sustains the people's identity in the face of changes in the American Southwest. This image harkens back to a period between 1851 and 1853, when the United States experienced intense urban and cultural expansion, driven by the gold rush. In this scene, the Irish woman Lola Montez travels stages from New York to San Francisco. Her bold performance, shaped by European theater, captivates audiences and propels her as a central figure in the emerging American drama. Tiburcio Vasquez, a Californian born in 1835, operated as an outlaw between 1854 and 1874, a period when California transitioned from Mexican to American sovereignty. The 1865 image shows him already famous for leading gangs, robbing stagecoaches and evading posses, a figure seen by some as resistance and by others as a threat. An image from 1900 shows a young indigenous girl of the original peoples of the United States. Her hand-woven, bead-adorned clothing expresses traditions transmitted through generations. On the dawn of the 20th century, such communities dealt with railroad expansion and the fixing of new boundaries, preserving rights, language, and a subsistence economy tied to the land. In the 1880s, when the telegraph sped up the news and large fairs drew crowds, John M. Burke, nicknamed the Prince of Press Agents, always appeared wearing his Stetson hat. By mastering interviews, serial stories, and press telegrams, he catapulted William Buffalo Bill Cody onto European stages, elevating him to the status of a universal myth of the Old West. Between 1870 and 1890, cowboys drove massive herds from Texas to the railheads of Kansas, a vital stage of the U.S. cattle economy. Upon reaching towns, they sought photographic studios, donning hats, bandanas, and holsters, capturing in the image their own labor conditions and the frontier ideal that shaped the West's expansion. In 1905, Ute leader Buckskin Charlie posed in Colorado displaying a peace medal, a symbol of the negotiations that, since the 19th century, marked contact between indigenous nations and the United States government. The insignia, granted after treaties, illustrates the phase when chiefs sought to secure territories and rights amid Anglo-American expansion, reflecting post-Civil War alliances and tensions. On the vast ZT Ranch in Pitchfork Park County, Wyoming, one sees the cowboy carrying out routines inherited from the cattle boom of the late 19th century, herding cattle across open pastures, branding calves, and monitoring the herd's health. The scene reflects the continuity of techniques and values that shaped the economy and culture of the American West's plains. Bill Doolin, born in 1858 in Arkansas, led the Wild Bunch Gang, which robbed trains and banks in the Oklahoma Territory between 1892 and 1896, a period of rapid settlement and little law enforcement. Hunted by federal sheriffs, he carried a high bounty. On August 5, 1896, in Lawson, Heck Thomas surprised him and fired around 20 shots, marking the end of the Old West. A photograph taken by Carl Wernz in the early years of the 20th century shows a young Hopi woman in the village of Misongnovi, Arizona. The scene illuminates indigenous daily life during America's industrial turn. Her distinctive hairstyle marks the transition to adulthood, while her dark mantle highlights ancient textile techniques maintained despite colonizing pressure. In 2025, Prescott, Arizona, celebrates the 138th Prescott Frontier Days, from June 28th to July 4th. Founded in 1888 when the Arizona Territory was gripped by gold fever, the rodeo preserves roping and riding practices that provided work for cowboys and mail carriers. In the 20th century, it became a showcase of cowboy skills, and today brings together classic competitions and audiences from across the Southwest. On October 30th, 1881, 4 days after the gunfight at the OK Corral, the streets of Tombstone witnessed the funeral procession for Tom and Frank McLaury and Billy Clanton. On the coffins was written, "Murdered on the streets of Tombstone." The slogan denounced the tension between the Earps and the Cowboys, and turned the funeral into a public act of mourning and protest. The photo from 1899 shows Song, a Pueblo man from the Rio Grande Valleys, in ceremonial dress. At the turn of the 20th century, after 4 centuries of Hispanic-Anglo contact, the Pueblo peoples maintained kivas, dances, and communal agriculture, resisting the pressure of territorial New Mexico. The image captures an instant when identity and ancestral practices still shaped indigenous daily life. In 1883, at the height of railroad expansion through the West, settlers christened the future town of Cody in the Wyoming Territory in honor of William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. The buffalo hunter, already famous for his traveling shows, attracted investors and travelers, spurring the region's settlement and symbolizing the myth of the American frontier. During the Alaska Gold Rush, 1896–1905, crowded mining camps sought fortune and entertainment. Kate Rockwell, known as Klondike Kate, enlivened the saloons of Skagway and Dawson with dances and popular songs. In red chiffon dresses, she transformed rustic spaces into vibrant stages, winning the admiration of prospectors. In the 1890 photograph, Tzu Che, also called Mrs. Minnie, appears among members of the Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico, a few years after railroad expansion integrated the region into the United States. Clothing, ornaments, and the communal setting reveal ceremonial practices, subsistence farming, and family bonds that sustained the village at the end of the 19th century. Diane Lane portrays Lorena Wood, a courtesan residing in the Dry Bean Saloon, a typical Texas institution on the 1870 frontier, when cattle trails drew male crowds and women had few opportunities. Lane earned an Emmy nomination for the role. Amid violence, gold fever, and flimsy laws, Lorena dreams of leaving, embodying the female quest for autonomy in the Old West. In 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War, James Butler Wild Bill Hickok posed in everyday attire. The image captures a veteran who had served as a Union scout and was already famed for duels in Springfield. In that period, frontier towns attracted migrants and conflict, and figures like Hickok personified the transition from military outposts to urban centers in the West. In the 1910s, with New Mexico newly admitted as a state, railroads and visitors drew photographers to the Taos Plateau. In this scene, a Pueblo family wears ceremonial and utilitarian garments, lined up in front of an adobe dwelling. The composition reveals domestic organization, familial ties, and the continuity of agricultural rituals inherited from ancestors. An early 20th century photograph shows miners in front of the tunnel of a hard rock mine, an environment marked by poor ventilation and carbide lamp lighting. During the industrial expansion phase, the risk of gas pocket explosions and cave-ins was constant, causing entrapment or severe injuries to workers who operated without safety regulations. By 1876, Dodge City had become a crucial hub for the cattle trails driving the Southwest economy. In that context, Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp, then officers of Ford County, posed shoulder to shoulder. The scene reveals the pact between lawmen seeking to impose order in a settlement marked by gambling, alcohol, and gunfighters. In 1915, on the arid plateau of the American Southwest, a Dine woman kneels at the edge of a winding creek to fill hand-molded clay vessels. The gesture, repeated each dawn, highlights the female role in water management at a time when herds, gardens, and families depended on the seasonal flow of waterways in Navajo territories, newly delimited by the federal government. In 1872, the U.S. Congress created Yellowstone National Park, a landmark of the young environmental preservation movement. In the same decade, the railroad network advanced toward the Pacific, shortening travel times and connecting hot springs and volcanic landscapes. The convergence of land protection and efficient transport drew an increasing public seeking leisure and healing, inaugurating modern tourism in the West. In 1905, Kohit Songwe, a young member of the Tewa Nation of New Mexico, was photographed wearing ceremonial dress. The scene, captured at the height of railroad expansion in the Southwest, shows how the Pueblo preserved ancestral rights even amid economic and demographic pressures. On the threshold of the 20th century, after centuries of Hispanic-American contact, such practices reinforced identities before new territorial authorities. In 1905, nearly 4 decades after the traumatic Long Walk, Dine horsemen advanced through Tessacad Canyon on lands now in Arizona. The group sought grazing routes, guided by ancestral memories, while the desert sun beat down on the rocky bed. The dust raised by hooves marks the Navajos' ongoing effort to preserve territory and ways of life. Early 20th century, Grand encampment in southern Wyoming illustrates the vigor of the expanding western frontier. The 1897 gold rush and copper extraction attracted investors, workers, and railroads, raising hotels, smelters, and aerial tramway lines over the Sierra Madre Range. The boom lasted until 1910, when falling prices ended the extraction fever. In the 1902 archives emerges the figure of Geronimo, leader of the Chiricahua Apache. Born in 1829 in what is now Arizona, he led campaigns against American expansion in the Southwest. After his capture in 1886, he became a symbol of indigenous resistance. His 1902 image evokes the final stage of the Apache Wars, when boundaries and cultures were being renegotiated in the West.